Yes.
Religion is like your belief, and I feel like spirituality is like more like your relationship with God.
I do think that they're the same thing, but I don't know.
Well, I think religion and spirituality, they are opposite.
I wouldn't say they're opposites. I said they go hand in hand. It's just that man has separated the two.
They're actually compatible. Spirituality branches off of religion, and religion's more of like it's more of a structure.
Religion is like church. Spiritual is like, it's your own personal devotion to God.
I think both of those two together, I think it's a good mix.
They go hand in hand, but like they're necessarily not the same thing.
You need spirituality in order to have religion, whereas with spirituality, it's not necessarily that you need the religious factor.
In a class I've been privileged to teach over the years, we often begin the first session by talking about those two terms, religion and spirituality. And I asked the students, would you define these terms for me? So I put spirituality up on the board and put religion up on the board, and the group begins the process of defining in their understanding the term spirituality and religion. Now, it's fairly predictable the things that end up on the spirituality side. Things like personal or internal or liberating or relationship. Those kinds of words appear year after year. Because students are describing that essence that goes on inside of us, that point of connection between our souls and God, the deep realities of what the human soul is. And then on this side, religion. What is religion? Now, sometimes it can go a little south here, but it depends on the group. Some will say, well, it's external. That was internal, this is external. It's corporate. It's social. Some will then say, well, it's rules and regulations. Others will say it's confining. So we'll spend some time trying to determine what religion is. And then I asked the second question, which is the question that was asked in the sermon intro video. What about these two terms? Are they friends or are they foes? Now that's where the discussion gets, at least in my mind, very interesting, because it provides an insight into how people think. I would say that if I were to take all the answers over all the years of discussing this, I would probably say that most people would say, most students in my classes would say, well, they may have originally been intended to be friends. But in my life, in our world, if they're friends, they're not on speaking terms. They might even be just outright foes. Well, each year that leaves me pondering and thinking, what about it? Should they be friends? Should they be foes? Now, I think it's a very fair statement to make that for many people, if not most people in the larger culture, and even for many people inside church buildings, they are at best not on speaking terms, and at worst, they're outright enemies. And I understand that. I understand that in the Western world, as Pastor Roy said last week. I understand that even more specifically here in the United States. I think there may be many reasons, but I'll give you just two. One reason why these have often become very uncomfortable with each other was something called the 1960s. Now, I realize that for you, the 60s are not a reality. You've only seen them on television. You watch them in reruns of Happy Days. That was the 60s. Well, the 60s was quite a turbulent time, not that I know so personally, but you get my drift. The 60s was a turbulent time because it was a time period when, in the Western world at least, there was a great deal of ferment and a great deal of suspicion of things authoritative. People didn't want to be a part of institutions. They questioned institutions. They put big bumper stickers on their cars that said, "Question authority." Get away from institutionalism. Rich kids gave up all they had and they went out and they lived in communes. They kicked off their shoes. They burned their draft cards, burned their bras. You didn't hear that in church. But that was the 1960s. Coming out of the 1960s, people were very suspicious of things institutional. And so when you started talking about something like religion, organized structure, church buildings, people were at best suspicious of that. That's one reason why I think we are where we are today. But the second reason I think we are where we are today is the psyche of the American mind. There was a sociologist named Robert Bellah who years ago, along with some colleagues, wrote a book called Habits of the Heart. Habits of the Heart represented a qualitative study they did of Americans and the American mindset. They went out and they interviewed people, asking them all kinds of questions about their lives, about their thinking, about their spirituality. And one of the things that Bellah underlines is we came face to face with the reality of a term that he didn't coin, but that he certainly used, and that was the term rugged individualism. He said, we Americans are rugged individualists. We are about me. In fact, he said, that even goes over into our religious and spiritual life. For example, they interviewed a woman named Sheila who lived up near San Francisco Bay Area. And they asked her questions about how she understood religion and faith and spirituality and the matters of the heart. Could she put it into words, what she believed? She worked with it for a while, and she finally came down to saying this. She said, I'll have to tell you that the religion I believe in, I would best call Sheilaism. Sheilaism, because it's what I have crafted myself. It's my own unique brand. Now, to Bellah and his colleagues, that made a lot of sense because Bellah said the quintessential hero in American life and even in American cinematography is the lone hero. It has been played by different people at different times. Years ago, it was John Wayne. Years later, it was Clint Eastwood. Somewhere in the mix, there was a show called The Lone Ranger. And Bellah and his colleagues talked about all of these. Here's the image. As the sun rises in the eastern sky in a western town that has come under the grip of thugs, you see him riding in from the direction of the sunset. He rides alone, sitting erect in the saddle, hat pulled down low over his eyes. As his beautiful steed prances down Main Street, people look out from behind curtains and over windows wondering, who is that man? He comes into the bar, drinks down his chug of liquor, and turns around and faces the thug, the enemy. By the time the smoke clears, by the time the ringing of rifle fire and pistol shot falls silent, you see him mounting his steed and riding out of town, leaving everybody asking, who was that man? You don't know where he came from. You don't know where he's going. But he's your hero. He saved the day. And Bellah and his colleagues says that's the hero in the American mindset. He's alone. He doesn't need anybody. And he can save the day. Now, by the time you combine the 60s with the rugged individualism of which Bellah and his colleagues wrote, you have a situation ready-made for Sheilaism. It's my religion. It's my unique crafting. It's my spirituality. I don't want to know what anyone else, even the church, has to say. Give me my space. Now, in some cultures, that's very bewildering, very curious, because they don't need that same kind of space, either spiritually or physically. You may know that of which I speak. When I was in my late teen years and my brother was in his early 20s, our family lived in Guatemala City in Central America. We rode the bus every day in our comings and goings, and as is probably the case with a lot of late teenage and early 20 young men, you're always attentive to who gets onto the bus of the female persuasion. So John and I wouldn't sit together. We sat in different places because we thought if today is the day God smiles on us, there will be a beautiful vixen that comes onto the bus and sits by me. He says, no, by me. I said, well, we'll see. And so we would sit alone, hoping that some beautiful young woman would sit down beside us. Now, I have to tell you that John was usually the winner in that escapade, and I remember one day I was glad he won. We were on the bus that day, and there weren't many people on the bus, a lot of empty seats. We were up to our usual thing. I was sitting in one place, he was sitting in the other. All kinds of empty seats in the bus. When this kid got on, boy, 10, 11, 12 years old, just the age to create mischief. He got on and he surveyed the bus quickly. He went past all those empty seats and crowded in and pushed up and sat next to my brother John. And I couldn't help but just laughing at him. And I could see John getting angry, his brow furrowed. When we got off the bus, he says, man, what's wrong with that kid? Got the whole bus empty, crowds up next to me. I don't like that. But the truth is, that was the culture. There wasn't the need for space. It wasn't just that young man. We would ride buses that were crammed in shoulder to shoulder where you said no one else fits, but 5 more did. Because there wasn't the need for that kind of space, physically or spiritually. But drive down the 91. Notice the few cars in the express carpool lane and all the cars with one person in them, the driver. And you understand a bit of what promotes Sheilaism. It's just me. It's my spirituality. No one else really matters. But there is a problem with that. The problem is when you take Scripture and you read the New Testament, there's a phrase you keep coming across. It's a 2-word phrase, one another. One another. One another occurs time and time again. Why? Because the Bible has no concept of the Lone Ranger Christian. It has no concept of I do it all by myself. It is all in a body, a community, a fellowship. Now that's problematic for many of the mindset in the Western world. And I understand why sometimes. Because some have grown up in a church and a world that is all about rules and regulations, and you have to do it this way and you can't do it that way, and this is the way that we do it here. And they find that far too confining. Sometimes it just doesn't make sense. Years ago, our family was traveling, and we were on our way to the checkpoint, security checkpoint. Our kids at that age had their own little backpacks, their own little suitcases that they drug along behind them. But on that day, as was often the case, they were tired. And so I had picked up both of their backpacks. I was carrying those, pulling mine and carrying mine. We got up to the security checkpoint. The 4 of us were standing right there. And the woman who was there that day looked at our tickets, and then she looked at me and she said, you can't board with all those things. And I said, well, I know. These are actually my kids. I just have 2, and we have enough. It all matches up. She looked at me and said, you can't board with all those things. I said, well, I know, I understand. These actually belong to my kids. These 2 belong to them, and this belongs to... She looked at me and said, you can't board with all those things. And I said, why can I not carry it for them? And that's all she would say. You can't board with all those things. So I said, well, fine, And so I'm putting the backpacks on the kids and giving them the thing. We finally get all arranged. Everybody now has 2. She looks, she says, all right, go ahead. And through we go. And you know what happened right on the other side of that? Daddy. And off they came, and I'm carrying them again. And I looked back, and I thought, just following the rules with no flex and no question. How at times like religion that is. In fact, it reminded me of these words. It'll take just a moment to read them, but it's worth listening. This comes from a New Testament commentary commenting on the way the religion of Jesus' day was. Ask yourself as you hear this if you would grow weary of this. The religion of the day was a thing of burdens. Jesus said of the scribes and Pharisees, they tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on the shoulders of others. To them, religion was a thing of endless rules. People lived their lives in a forest of regulations which dictated every action. They must forever listen to a voice which said, you shall not. Even the rabbis saw this. There's a kind of rueful parable put into the mouth of Korah which shows just how binding and constricting and burdensome and impossible the demands of the law could be. Here's the parable. There was a poor widow in my neighborhood who had 2 daughters and a field. When she began to plow her field, Moses, that is the law of Moses, said, "You must not plow with an ox and a donkey together." When she began to sow her field, he said, "You must not sow your field with mingled seed." When she began to reap and make stacks of corn, he said, "When you reap your harvest in your field and have forgotten a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it, and you shall not reap your field to the very border." She began to thresh, and he said, "Give me the heave offering and the first and second tithe." She accepted all these ordinances and gave them all to him. Then what did the poor woman do? She sold her field and bought 2 sheep to clothe herself from their fleece and to have profit from their young. When they bore their young, Aaron, that is, the demands of the priesthood, said, "Give me the firstborn." So she accepted the decision and gave them to him. When shearing time came and she sheared them, Aaron said, "Give me the first of the fleece of the sheep." Then she thought, "I can't stand against this man. I will slaughter the sheep and eat them." Then Aaron came and said, "Give me the shoulder and the cheeks and the stomach." Then she said, "Even when I have killed them, I am not safe from you. Behold, they shall be devoted as an offering to God." And then Aaron said, "In that case, they belong entirely to me." He took them and went away, leaving her weeping with her daughters. The story is a parable of the continuous demands of the law made upon every facet of life. It was a burden. I suspect if they had had the courage to say so, had you asked the people of Jesus' world, spirituality, religion, friend or foe, and they would have said, "Give me spirituality, my relationship with God, but please, I don't know about religion." Well, Jesus had something to say about this. And I want to read it to you. It is in the context of that religion described by that commentary. It's in that context where people were burdened down, where they had the weight of all that had been laid on their back, wearying them, leaving them asking questions. Is there any way to have a relationship with God that is free? Listen to what Jesus said to such people. Matthew 11, verse 28. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." It's interesting what Jesus says. Interesting because I would contend that Jesus was a profoundly spiritual person and that Jesus was a profoundly religious person. In fact, having dedicated much of my life to studying this book and studying his life, I have concluded that the reason it worked so well for Jesus is that internal relationship he had with his Father was given full and accurate expression in the communal participation in the religion of his day. It's interesting because he partook in all of the rituals. He went to the ceremonies, participated in the feasts. In fact, Luke even tells us in Luke 4 that he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day as was his custom. He took part in all of them. They were a part of his everyday life, these outward religious acts. But who could ever argue the intensity of his inner spiritual life? The Jesus whom the gospel tells us over and over again was found alone in the early morning or all through the night in communion with his Father. Just read the Gospel of John. That gospel, 21 chapters long, where he refers to his Father well over 100 times. Through the gospel, he's constantly talking about my Father and me. My Father would do this. My Father would have me do that. Oh, Father, if it be possible, he would pray. Profoundly spiritual, deeply religious. And it leaves me with the question, why did it work so well in his life? Maybe it worked well because, first of all, we are created in our hearts and souls with a God-shaped vacuum. In fact, St. Augustine said it well so many centuries ago when he said, "Our hearts are restless, O God, until they find their rest in Thee." So there is this deep yearning for something more than this world can provide. Sometimes we get a sense of that in some of the magnificent places of nature. If you have stood late at night in a place that is bereft of artificial light and have been able to look up and see the panoply of the heavens, breathtaking, you have felt some of that insignificance that caused the psalmist to write and to ask the question, when I look at the skies, the works of your hands, I ask the question, what are human beings that you are mindful of us? And that sense of smallness and finitude that comes has within it a yearning for God. Or you stand on Half Dome and look out at the Yosemite Valley. You look at El Capitan in the distance, the Merced River, a tiny ribbon running through the lush green valley, and you say, is this real, or is this cast upon the canvas by an artist? Who is behind this? And you sense that deep yearning for God. Or you stand, as I stood not too many weeks ago, at the grave of a loved one. There was his name, Bobby Lee Roberts, 1928 to 2013. And I thought, a life well lived, lived in the service of God. I thought, I yearn for my life to be lived in that way. A yearning for God. Jesus had that from a very early age, that yearning for his relationship with his Father, his spiritual life. But then on the other hand, we recognize that we are created for community, for connection, for fellowship with others. We are people of ritual. Sometimes ritual gets cast as a very negative reality. I would vigorously challenge that. Do you want to know how important ritual is for us? Then I have a suggestion for you. 4 or 5 days from now, this coming Thursday, just before you sit down to watch the Cowboys beat the Raiders, this coming Thursday, just before that happens, change your ritual. Tell your family, you know what? We're not going to eat at the big dining room table today. We're not going to have turkey or tofurkey or whatever you want to call it. We're not going to do that. We're going to sit out on the back porch and eat popcorn and apples and play croquet. That's Thanksgiving this year. And then let me know how that works out for you. We are people of ritual, of tradition. And that's not bad unless the traditions have lost their inner meaning. I love the way the theologian Jaroslav Pelikan says it. He says, traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. But tradition, that's the living faith of the dead. That kind of tradition I want in my life, in my family, in my church. That tradition that is filled, is pregnant with meaning, in which we participate. It resonates with our inner spiritual life, but it is acted out in the community of the church. Then we can stand shoulder to shoulder, singing with all of our hearts the praises of God in community with a gusto that would never happen alone. Jesus was a man of religion. But his religion is very personal. I want you to notice, after all, what he says when he issues this invitation. Did you notice it? 3 words. He says, come to me. To me. He doesn't begin by saying, come to church, come to obey, come to learn, come to fulfill your obligations. He says, come to me. Because first and foremost, whether you speak of spirituality or religion, it all begins with Him. That full, vibrant, vital connection with Jesus. Oh, He will have a yoke for you to wear. And a yoke is made for two, not for one, typically. You work in community with the other. You pull someone back there to feed others out there. It is a communal experience. So what about it? Spirituality, religion, friends or foes? I would suggest to you that religion and spirituality are profound friends when a vibrant inner life with Jesus is expressed with integrity in our outer life in the church. Then they are friends. And that is what Jesus offers. There's an old legend, and it's old, almost, not quite, almost back to the time of Jesus. Here's what the legend says. The legend says that in Galilee, Jesus was known for the yokes He made in His carpenter shop. That He would look at your animals. Were you going to pull these with oxen? Were you going to pull them with donkey? What were you going to use? Mules? He would look at your animals. He would measure their size. And then He would go into His shop and He would craft and He would carve until the yoke with which He emerged fit well. In fact, says the legend, it came to be known that Jesus made the best fitting yokes in all the land. And they said, He put a sign up above the doorway of His carpenter shop. And the hand-painted sign simply said, my yoke fits well. Well, you know what? It still does. Fits well in our hearts, our spiritual lives. Fits well in our outer practice, our communal life, so that our spirituality and our religion can be best friends. God of grace, we thank You for Jesus. We thank You for His call, for His invitation to come to Him first and foremost. Lord, that is our yearning, that is our desire, that we might walk with Him deeply, meaningfully, eternally in our inner lives. And then that our outer life, our religious life, might be an expression with integrity of what happens in our inner world. So bless us individually and bless us as a community is my prayer. In Jesus' name, amen.